The snow fell in thick, wet sheets over the French village of Holtzwihr. It was late January 1945, and the war in Europe was nearing its bloody end. The Allied armies were pushing east, closing in on the Rhine River, while German troops made one last desperate stand in Alsace. Among the exhausted American soldiers holding the frozen front line was a thin, quiet lieutenant named Audie Murphy, just 19 years old, the youngest officer in his company, but already a veteran of more battles than most men would fight in a lifetime. He had survived Sicily, Anzio, and southern France. He had been wounded, promoted, decorated, and hardened by loss. But nothing he had faced would compare to what happened that day outside Holtzwihr. Holding the line, Company B of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division had been ordered to hold a small stretch of road leading into Holtzwihr. It looked like an ordinary country lane, bordered by snow-covered trees. But tactically, it was everything. If the Germans broke through there, they could outflank the entire American position. Murphy's platoon, barely 40 men strong, was all that stood in their way. The men were exhausted. Supplies were short. A few half-frozen tanks from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion provided the only real firepower. The snow was knee-deep, and the temperature hovered near freezing. Murphy moved through the line, checking foxholes, whispering encouragement, and making sure his men had extra ammunition. To them, he was steady, calm, and unshakable, the kind of leader who didn't yell, didn't panic, and somehow made you believe you could survive the impossible. At about 2 p.m., scouts reported movement in the woods ahead. Then came the sound, the low, metallic clatter of tank tracks. The Germans were coming. The German assault. The first shells hit moments later. Artillery screamed overhead and exploded in the trees, showering the Americans with wood and snow. Men ducked in their foxholes as mortars followed. The forest filled with smoke and flame. When the barrage lifted, the enemy appeared. 6 German tanks followed by waves of infantry in white camouflage. The scene looked unreal, like a black and white nightmare moving through the snow. Murphy's tank destroyers fired the first shots, knocking out one of the lead tanks. The others kept advancing, firing their 88mm guns and machine guns. Within minutes, one of the American tank destroyers took a direct hit and exploded. Flames shot 20 feet into the air. Murphy knew they couldn't hold much longer. He ordered his men to fall back to the tree line and take up defensive positions. Then, as they moved, he stayed behind to direct artillery fire over the radio. The lone stand, the burning tank destroyer, was just ahead of him, its .50 caliber machine gun still intact, its crew either dead or gone. Murphy climbed onto the flaming wreck. Bullets cracked around him. His boots slipped on the icy metal, and the heat was intense enough to melt the snow at his feet. But he grabbed the machine gun and started firing. German soldiers advancing across the field were caught in the open. Murphy raked them with bursts from the heavy gun, cutting down dozens. When one group tried to flank him, he called in artillery on their position, so close that shrapnel rained over his own head. "Adjust fire. Target my position," he shouted into the radio. The operator on the other end hesitated. "But Lieutenant, that's right on top of you." "I said fire." Shells landed all around, tearing holes in the German lines. Still, they came on. Tanks fired point blank, their shells whistling past him. One exploded just yards away, blasting him with shrapnel and smoke. Murphy's pant leg was soaked with blood from a wound in his leg. But he didn't stop. He fired until the gun overheated, then waited for it to cool before firing again. For nearly an hour, he fought alone, one man against a company of German soldiers and half a dozen tanks. Every time the smoke cleared, the enemy still saw that same figure on the burning tank destroyer, firing relentlessly, refusing to fall. "Let's go get them." When his ammunition finally ran out, Murphy jumped down from the wreck and limped back toward his men. His face was black with soot, his eyes red from smoke. The soldiers who saw him later said he looked like a ghost, exhausted but calm. "Are you all right, Lieutenant?" one of them asked. Murphy nodded. "Yeah," he said. "Let's go get them." He immediately organized a counterattack, leading his remaining men back across the field. The Germans, stunned and demoralized by the lone defender they had just faced, began to retreat. The Americans swept forward, retaking their lost ground and securing the road once more. When the fighting stopped, at least 50 enemy soldiers lay dead, dozens more wounded. The surviving Germans had fled into the forest. Company B had held the line, because one man refused to give it up. After the battle, when it was over, Murphy could barely stand. His leg was bleeding badly, and his uniform was scorched. Medics begged him to go to the aid station, but he refused until he checked every position and accounted for every man. Only when the wounded were evacuated did he allow himself to collapse. His commanding officer filed an immediate report, recommending Murphy for the Medal of Honor. It was the only award left that he didn't already have. The Medal of Honor citation. Months later, standing in a quiet ceremony in Austria, Audie Murphy received the United States' highest decoration for valor. The official citation told only part of the story. Second Lieutenant Murphy's directing of artillery fire wiped out many of the enemy. He killed or wounded about 50. His directing of artillery fire inspired his company to hold their position and defeat the enemy. But those who were there remembered more. They remembered how he had shouted orders over exploding shells, how the firelight reflected off the snow, how the entire German advance had stalled because one 19-year-old refused to give an inch. What made him different? After the war, people kept asking Murphy the same question. How did you do it? He always gave the same answer. They were killing my friends. He never spoke of bravery or glory. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a soldier doing his job. But for those who fought beside him, that day at Holtzwihr became legend. Veterans who witnessed it later said it was the greatest single act of courage they had ever seen. The cost of courage. The Battle of Holtzwihr made Audie Murphy famous, but it also marked him for life. He carried the physical scars, shrapnel in his leg, pain in his back, but the invisible wounds ran deeper. The nightmares, the guilt, the constant tension of expecting another attack never truly left him. He once admitted, "You can get used to killing, but you can't get used to losing friends." Even after he became a movie star, those memories haunted him. He would later say that no Hollywood explosion could ever match the sound of the real thing. Why it matters. Historians have called the stand at Holtzwihr one of the most extraordinary acts of bravery in modern military history. In tactical terms, Murphy's actions saved his company from being overrun and allowed the 3rd Division to continue its advance. In human terms, it became a symbol of what one person can do when pushed beyond all limits. His Medal of Honor didn't just recognize a single battle. It represented every soldier who ever stood their ground in the face of overwhelming odds. The scene remembered. Imagine it now. A snow-covered field in eastern France, a burning tank destroyer lighting up the white landscape, and one small figure, silhouetted against the flames, holding a heavy machine gun as the world crashes around him. That was Audie Murphy. Not a myth. Not a movie hero. Just a man, cold, bleeding, and unbreakable. Epilogue. Audie Murphy went on to become the most decorated soldier in American history. He survived the war, became a writer, an actor, and a voice for veterans struggling to live after battle. But to the men who knew him, he would always be remembered for that one day in January 1945, when he stood alone on a burning tank destroyer and proved that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to stand your ground no matter